Hi friends, I am so glad you tuned in to Park TV Channel 15 to watch an incredible adventure that I'm going to take you down the Mississippi River in a kayak. My name is Doug Ohman. I'm a Minnesota photographer, historic storyteller, and I have been working with St. Louis Park Community Education in conjunction with Park TV to bring you this program today. So again, I want to thank you for joining us today. I want you to sit back, but I want you to really enjoy an adventure that I was privileged to go on myself, and I want to take you along. About 10 years ago, I was commissioned by a group out of Brainerd. The group name is called the Mississippi Headwaters Board. And they called me up one day. I didn't know anything about who they were. They said, Doug, we are the caretakers of the first 400 miles of the Mississippi River. And we are doing a guidebook. This is the guidebook. And we want to ask you if you would be our photographer for the guidebook. And of course I said, yes, I'd love to do it. And then they said, we want you to photograph the first 400 miles of the Mississippi. The first question I had, how far is the first 400 miles? How far do you go? We all know, if we've been in Minnesota very long, the Mississippi River starts at Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. But 400 river miles later, where do you think you end up? I was surprised when I learned that 400 miles down the river only brings you to Little Falls by river. So they said, that is the area that we want you to photograph. The best way to photograph the river, I thought, would be to actually immerse myself into the river by taking a kayak. But I didn't realize how far 400 miles was in a kayak. So for the next hour or so, I'm going to take you on that adventure with me. I want you to feel like you're riding right with me in the kayak as we explore northern Minnesota. And I think you're going to learn a lot about our state, the history, and you're going to see the beauty of northern Minnesota. So again, thank you for joining me today, and I'm glad to have you along as we travel the upper Mississippi River. Hi friends, my name is Doug Ohman. I'm a Minnesota photographer, historian, and storyteller. And I'm glad you joined me today because I'm about to take you on an adventure. It all started for me a few years ago when I received a phone call from a group in Brainerd, Minnesota. When they called, they said, we are the Mississippi Headwaters Board, and we want to know if you want to work with us on a project. Even before I knew what the project was, I said yes. But when they told me they wanted me to help them develop a guidebook for the upper Mississippi, I said, what would you like me to do? They said, we love your photography. We love your eye. Would you be willing to provide us images that we can put in to a guidebook? About a year later, the guidebook came out. And I'm really excited to share that adventure with you today. The upper Mississippi River. What an incredible treasure that we have here in Minnesota. And in order to do this project correctly, I knew that it would be best if I actually paddled the first 400 miles of the Mississippi. That is what the Mississippi Headwaters Board, that is their area that they oversee here in Minnesota. So when they asked me to take pictures, I thought, should I take my truck and drive the roads, or should I really immerse myself into the river? And that's exactly what I decided to do. I decided to buy a couple of kayaks, and I decided that I would actually paddle the first 400 miles of the Mississippi. So I want to take you on that adventure with me. We're going to look at pictures, I'm going to tell you stories, and we're going to explore this incredible treasure that we have in Minnesota. But before we put the kayaks in the water, I want to talk about the Mississippi River. Generally speaking, when we think about the Mississippi, we think of America's river. And the Mississippi really is America's river. America has a lot of rivers. I mean, we are a nation of rivers. Think about our river system, from the Ohio to the Colorado, to the Potomac, to the Hudson. But when you think of a river in America, you really think
of the Mississippi. What most people don't realize is that the Mississippi River has more miles in Minnesota than any other state in the country. The Mississippi River flows over 2,500 miles from northern Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. In its journey, it will touch 10 states. It'll flow through 2 states, the 2 bookend states, Minnesota on the north and Louisiana in the south. But it'll touch 8 other states on its incredible journey through the heart of America. And if you think about that river, it is America's river because there's been a lot of things written about this incredible riverway. Think about Mark Twain and think about some of those stories that you probably grew up reading. And again, it is America's river. How did we know this river was here? Well, Native Americans obviously knew the river was here long before we even know. But the first European to show up to see the river was a man by the name of Hernando de Soto. Now, Hernando de Soto was a Spanish explorer. He was in the army, and he was sent on a mission to explore this new continent that we now know as North America. In 1542, I believe was the date, Hernando de Soto discovered the Mississippi River in what is now Louisiana. And tragically, he died on the banks of the river. What's interesting about that story, he discovers it in the 1500s, but it's not until 1832 when we find out where this river actually begins. And it begins in northern Minnesota. And who was the man that discovered the headwaters of this incredible riverway? It was a man in 1832 by the name of Henry Schoolcraft. And when Henry Schoolcraft discovered it, America didn't know where this river started. So it was really kind of a monumental discovery for our new nation. And who was Henry Schoolcraft? He was a geologist and an explorer. And he was sent on a mission to find the start of this riverway. And he did it in 1832. So in all reality, we should start our journey right along with Henry Schoolcraft in 1832. Most of us know that the Mississippi River starts in a beautiful lake in northern Minnesota called Lake Itasca. And if you've been up to Lake Itasca State Park, you know this beautiful lake, and you probably went up there to actually walk across the Mississippi River at its headwaters. And that's where we're going to start pretty close to where those rocks are. But we're actually going to start in the lake. Because in 1832, when Henry Schoolcraft arrived in northern Minnesota to find the headwaters, he actually came overland on an Indian trail being guided by Ojibwa Indians to locate this incredible river. When he got to Lake Itasca, it was in the summer of 1832, he paddled across the lake, and the Indians had told him that the river started on the other side of the lake. But they had arrived late in the day, so they spent one night on an island on Lake Itasca. And that island today is called Schoolcraft Island. And when he camped there, he only spent one night. And I know why now he only spent one night. Sure, he was in a hurry to see the headwaters of the Mississippi. But he talks about the mosquitoes. In his diary, you can read the diaries of Henry Schoolcraft, and he'll talk about the mosquitoes. And he says, I would rather have been attacked by a wild bear than deal with these crazy bugs in this part of the state. And if you've been in Minnesota for any length of time, especially in the summertime in northern Minnesota, you know that the mosquitoes can be quite a pain, and they certainly were to Henry Schoolcraft and his men. So let's go to Schoolcraft Island and let's start our trip. We put into the lake here. You'll see the front end of my kayak here as I'm paddling to that clump of trees ahead of you known as Schoolcraft Island. When I got there, I was by myself, and I decided to get out and take a picture by this historic sign. And I've shown you a picture of Henry Schoolcraft, but let me show you a better picture of him, more attractive. Yes, of course, that is me standing there. And as I stood there and I took this self-portrait, I didn't realize it at the time when I took the picture. It was a few minutes later. I looked down, and yes, I was standing in a large patch of poison ivy. And I'm very susceptible to poison ivy, so you can imagine in a couple of days what I was dealing with. And imagine what Henry Schoolcraft and his men had to deal with as well. So let us begin our trip. From Henry Schoolcraft's island, he would have paddled over to what would have been the outlet for the Mississippi River, or the headwaters. And today, we have these rocks. Many of you have been up there. You've probably walked across those rocks, taken pictures of your family and friends. Everybody saying, I've walked across the mighty Mississippi. And at this point, if you track the mileage of the Mississippi, it would be over 2,500 miles before it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River is the fourth longest river in the world. It follows the Nile, the Amazon, and the river in China called the Yangtze. But we are the fourth longest river. So from this point, I had to portage over those rocks, and some tourists were there to help me drag my kayak over those rocks. And then I began to make my journey. I was going to paddle 400 miles. Now you might ask how far 400 miles takes you. Where are you at mile 400? According to the Mississippi Headwaters Board in Brainerd, Minnesota, they said 400 miles will take you to Little Falls. I was surprised by that because I thought maybe it would be much, much further, maybe the Twin Cities or even further south. But Little Falls is where mile 400 is on the Mississippi River. So as I began my trip, I decided that I would paddle the entire thing, of course, but heading north from the rocks there at Itasca, I arrived about a day and a half to 2 days later. I arrived in the first town of Bemidji. But before we get to Bemidji, let's talk about this upper section of the Mississippi. It is the most wild section that we will experience on this trip. What I mean by that is it's the most remote area of the Mississippi River. And in fact, what people don't realize, that first 90 miles of the Mississippi, you're actually paddling north. You're not going to the Gulf of Mexico, you're going actually north. So as we paddled north, the river is very small in this section, as you can see. In fact, I could take my kayak paddle and touch both banks of the river at the same time. That's how small it was. And as I was paddling north, I actually got lost. Now you might say, how do you get lost on the river? Well, I found a way. I actually got lost. What happens is you get to an area where it has 3 or 4 channels going in different directions, and you don't know which direction to take because they all look pretty much the same, and there are no signs saying this is the main channel, these are dead-end channels. They don't tell you that. So I had to try to figure this thing out by trial and error. And of course, I made some errors. But then I learned that in order to find the true channel of the river, one only has to look down into the grass of the river, and you will see the grass will bend ever so slightly in the direction of the current. That is the main channel. So you basically read the grass in the water. And the water in this part of the river is amazingly clean. I could see down a number of feet just from my kayak. So I continued north for 90 miles. As I was traveling north, I was thinking about what was going on in this part of Minnesota just maybe 100, 150 years ago. And I'm a historian, so I know that logging was an important industry in this part of the state. And I learned later that between Lake Itasca and the first major town of Bemidji, there were 19 sawmills operating on the Mississippi River, or near it. And I thought about those lumbermen that went into the woods in the wintertime. They would cut the trees, they would drag the logs on the ice and snow. That's the reason they harvested trees in the winter. And when they would pile them up on the river, they would wait for the spring thaw. And when the spring thaw came, the river would actually carry their logs down to the sawmill, which was really kind of an innovative way to log. So I was thinking about, as I was paddling, that I'm paddling by Minnesota history right here on the river. But as I get closer to Bemidji, I began to leave that wilderness feel. I began to see houses, I began to see cabins, I began to see signs of civilization. And sort of in my mind, I'm kind of sad about that because I'm thinking I'll probably never have a sense of wilderness experience on the Mississippi for the rest of the trip. But there's advantages to seeing a different part of the river as we get close to town as well. People came out to wave as I paddled by, and it was just really kind of a nice experience. One of the things they loved to ask me as I went by their cabin or their home on the river, how far are you going? They would yell out. And when I would tell them I'm going to Little Falls, they would be so disappointed. Why aren't you going all the way to New Orleans? They would say. And of course I would say, well, we'll tackle that down the road. But right now, Little Falls seems like a pretty good adventure for me anyway. So we get to the town of Bemidji. Now, Bemidji is a fairly good-sized town in northern Minnesota. Many of you have been up to Bemidji. And Bemidji is there because, again, of that logging industry that was so important to the development of this part of Minnesota. And when we pull into Bemidji, you're going to notice that we are paddling into a large body of water. The first major lake that we arrive at is Lake Bemidji. And from Lake Bemidji, for the next 130 miles, we'll be paddling through some very large lakes that we'll talk about in a minute. When we get to Bemidji, though, let's get out. Let's stretch our legs. Let's take a walk around town. And Bemidji is a great town. It's a tourist town today. But again, it was built there because of the logging and the lumber industry. And it's not too hard to miss an icon, well, actually two icons in Minnesota right there in Bemidji. And you know what I'm talking about, Paul and Babe. Paul and Babe came to Bemidji in 1937, as the sign says here below Paul and Babe here in Bemidji. Why did they come, and where did they come from? Now, according to legend, they came to Bemidji to help Bemidji. Actually, this is the truth. They actually came to Bemidji to help the town through the Great Depression. The legend part of it is that they came from Maine, and they were in the logging business. Paul Bunyan was a logger, and Babe actually dragged the logs out of the woods, as the big blue ox would do. And when they got to Bemidji, they actually, Babe walked the whole way, and according to legend, he created the Great Lakes. Well, we can laugh about that story because it's a great Minnesota story, a great American story. But Paul Bunyan has made a home in Minnesota. He's not only in Bemidji, he's in other towns as well. But the Bemidji Paul and Babe are the original Paul and Babe. So we got to say that this is the authentic Paul and Babe. So let's take our pictures there. Again, let's walk around town, enjoy the town, stretch our legs, because we have some paddling to do as we leave Bemidji. And when we leave Bemidji, we have to paddle kind of in a crisscross section across Lake Bemidji. And when we get across to the other side, the east side of Lake Bemidji, we will see the outlet for the river. So the river literally flows through the lake. And when we get to the other side of Lake Bemidji, you'll notice that the river's gotten quite a bit bigger. And the river has been growing ever since we left Lake Itasca. But rivers get bigger because of other streams and tributaries that actually flow in to make it bigger. And the river character will now change dramatically as we leave Lake Bemidji. As we are not paddling south yet, we're paddling east. And we'll paddle east for about 130 miles until we get to our next major town, which will be Grand Rapids. But before we get to Grand Rapids, we have some adventures to explore and to enjoy on the river. Again, you're going to see a lot more civilization. The wilderness section of the river is gone. We won't see that anymore. But along the way, you'll see cabins, you'll see resorts, you'll see people enjoying the river. There'll be people out fishing, there'll be people boating, all kinds of activities as I paddled my kayak in this section. And the other thing I didn't mention so far, but along the way, we are going to experience a lot of wildlife. Wildlife along the river is part of the benefit of being on the water in a kayak. As you know, a kayak is very quiet. So you can pretty much sneak up on a lot of wild animals. They don't even know you're there until the last minute. So you can take some great pictures. You can bring some binoculars, bring your camera, and enjoy the river and enjoy the wildlife on the river. Here's a great blue heron. You'll see a lot of waterfowl. You'll see ducks and geese and other birds, a lot of great birds along the river. You'll also see land animals, mammals. Deer certainly is always fun to come around a bend of a river and see some deer. I saw beaver, I even saw some otters, and that was really cool. So enjoy the wildlife along the Mississippi. But about 8 miles east of Bemidji, we have our first major portage. Now, when I say the word portage, some of you remember going up to the Boundary Waters canoe area and having to carry your canoe from one lake to another. That's when we think of portages, that's what we think of. But we actually have to portage, not from one lake to another, but around an obstacle in the river. It's a large hydraulic dam. Now, these dams were built, and there's going to be a series of them now in the next few miles. These dams were built back in the 1890s as flood control or water control dams. The river down south at the Twin Cities and further south during the summer would, on many summers, get very low. So the river needed water in order to operate the commerce on the river south of the Twin Cities. But they didn't know how to get the water. So they came up with this idea that if we dam the upper Mississippi, up in the woods basically, and we create these large reservoirs, because that's what's created behind a dam, is a large body of water. And then when we need the water down south, we'll release the water out of the dam, and the water will flow downstream, eventually getting down to the Twin Cities to help again in the commerce that was needed on the river. And so these dams were built, again, long before they were electrical dams. We have since put the electrical feature into these dams, and so we actually generate electricity from them today. But we have to portage around them, and you'll see signs, and there'll be a trail around the dam, and you just drag your canoe or kayak, and then you put in on the other side, and you continue down the river. Again, you can see the river's getting larger as we move further east. And these large reservoirs, we call them lakes, and they are natural lakes, but they've gotten much bigger. And we're going to paddle through a couple of very, very large lakes. The first one is Cass Lake. And Cass Lake is a large lake, but the second one is even bigger. It's called Lake Winnebagosh. And both of those lakes are fairly shallow, especially Lake Winnie. Lake Winnie is a shallow lake. So what does that mean to a kayaker? If you want to take the shortest distance, cross the lake right across the heart of the lake. But it is dangerous because shallow lakes produce bigger waves. And if you got caught out in Lake Winnie in a kayak, in a storm, or when the wind picked up, you could be in trouble. So I didn't want to take the chance. So I skirted the shoreline. It took me a lot longer, but I was safe as I moved across these large bodies of water, these lakes. And I call this area the Lake District of Minnesota, or the Lake District of the Mississippi River. And then we will continue to paddle along. And I should show you one of the kayaks that I used. People ask me all the time, what kind of kayak was the best to use on the river? I actually brought two kayaks along. I didn't obviously paddle both of them at the same time, but I brought two kayaks. And the kayak I'm about to show you is a really unique kayak. It's a pedal kayak. You actually sit and use your legs to propel yourself down the river, meaning it has fins down below the kayak that actually move back and forth like a penguin, and you pedal it, or you push it with these pedals. And it really is a slick kayak because you don't have to hold a paddle in your hands. And that allows you to take pictures, that allows you to use your binoculars, that allows you to fish if you want. The pedal kayak was a great, great boat. And then I also have a traditional Eskimo-style kayak as well. And that was a fun kayak, especially in shallow water. And that's the one I used on that first 90 miles of the Mississippi. From Lake Itasca to Bemidji, I used the traditional kayak because it actually would operate in about 6 inches of water if you needed to. As we leave the large lakes, we're going to be paddling now for a few miles before we start seeing a lot of civilization again as we get closer to the town of Grand Rapids. A couple of interesting features before we get to the town. You're going to notice this outcrop of rocks. Now, we haven't seen a lot of rocks on the Mississippi so far. It's been a lot of low, kind of marshy countryside with a lot of wild rice. But now we're going to see this stretch of rocks. Now, these rocks are an interesting geological feature. They are a part of what we call the Great Canadian Shield. It starts up in Canada, this rock formation, and it comes down into Minnesota through the Arrowhead. And it ends about 10 miles west of Grand Rapids. And the Mississippi flows right by these rocks. So it's kind of an interesting feature that we'll experience here as we get closer to the town. One of the other things I want to mention before we get too much further on the trip, some of you might be saying, well, I don't know if I'm up to kayaking the Mississippi. How do I experience the Mississippi in an easier way? I don't feel like portaging. I don't feel like dealing with the mosquitoes, and I don't have a kayak. You can follow the Mississippi River by road. It's called the National Route, or the Great River Road. There's signs along the river throughout America, right from Lake Itasca all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. You can actually drive the Mississippi along the road. So follow those green and white signs and you will experience a part of Americana that everyone should experience. Follow the river. So as we get closer to Grand Rapids, we have another portage to go around. We have the Pokegama Dam we have to portage around. And then we see ahead of us the Blandon Paper Mill. Now, a lot of people know that name here in Minnesota, but it sits here in Grand Rapids. It's not called Blandon today. It's got another name because it was bought up by a Finnish company, I believe. But we'll pass the Blandon Paper Mill, and we'll also see more people enjoying the river, much like we saw closer to Bemidji. And here's a picture of people fishing on this dock that stretches out over the river. And look at that. If you got one more person on that dock, I think the whole dock would have gone into the water. But kind of fun. They visited with me as I glided by, and I asked them how the fishing was. And people do love to fish on the Mississippi, and we're going to see another fisherman in just a few minutes. When we get to Grand Rapids, one of the things that you'll notice about this town is they've really embraced the river in recent years. Now, if you were in Grand Rapids, let's say 40, maybe even 50 years ago, the river was an insignificant part of the town. Today, that's changed, and that's been the case with a lot of our towns that are located on the Mississippi. They're really embracing the river today. They're building walkways and paths and parks and other things just to let people know that the river is part of our town and we want to embrace it. It's no longer the dumping ground where years ago we turned our backs to the river. Now we are facing the river, embracing the river, and Grand Rapids is a great model for that. And here their new library is right there on the river. Large windows in this library. You can sit and read looking out over the Mississippi. So I think Grand Rapids is a great example of what we should do in every town located on the river. And other towns are following that certainly throughout our stretch here in Minnesota. When we get to Grand Rapids and we get just past the town, the river will make an abrupt right-hand turn. Now, we've been going north to Bemidji. Now we've gone east and a little south to Grand Rapids. But now we've made the big turn. Now we're actually paddling to the Gulf of Mexico, going south. And the river's gotten much bigger now. And the other thing you'll notice on the river is the watercolor will have changed. Early on in our trip, you could look down 3 or 4 feet. I could see the bottom. I can't now. Why is that? It's not because of pollution. A lot of times people say, well, it's dark water, it's got to be dirty. It's not actually dirty water. Again, I wouldn't drink it, but it's not dirty water. It's all to do with the decayed leaf matter, pine needles and things like that in northern Minnesota that are carried by the streams that flow into the Mississippi River from the north. And they come from some of the peat bogs up in northern Minnesota as well. And so that is why the watercolor has changed. And as you get a little bit south, I remember this day I was paddling, it was in the morning, and I came on this culvert, and there was a local fisherman fishing. I think he was local. He wasn't much of a conversationalist, but I watched him fish as he stood up there on the culvert, and I watched him for about 40 minutes. And he caught 5 different species of fish in about 40 minutes. I tried to ask him about it, and he didn't want to talk too much, as most fishermen are kind of quiet about that, you know. But he left, and so I decided to stretch my legs too, and I got up on the culvert, and I had brought my fishing pole, and I know I was using the exact same thing he was using. And I fished for over an hour, and I caught nothing. So I thought, how did he catch all those fish, and I didn't? Then I thought about it. He was fishing in his pajamas. Maybe that's the key right there, I don't know. So as we head further south, the first little town that we get to south of Grand Rapids is the town of Jacobson. Now Jacobson is a historic town, and what's interesting about Jacobson, as I glided under the bridge, the new concrete bridge, I thought about how people crossed the river back in the days when Jacobson and other towns on the river were being developed. And then I thought they wouldn't have had bridges, but they would have operated ferries. Do you know that between Aiken and Grand Rapids, back in the 1880s and 90s, there were actually 13 different ferry crossings? I don't know exactly where all of them were, but they were situated along this stretch of the river. And the ferry operation was a really unique operation. A local farmer would actually operate a ferry, and he would carry immigrants crossing the river, commerce, horses, wagons, and people in order to get them from one side to the other. And that farmer would make some added local money that he needed as well. So the ferries were an important little piece of business on the Mississippi. And then I also thought about, again, back to the logging industry that occurred on the Mississippi. Grand Rapids, like Bemidji, is a logging town. We have the forest center there in Grand Rapids today promoting the lumber industry. But think about the log drives on this part of the Mississippi. Wouldn't that have been a really unique part of our history to experience firsthand? Of course, we don't do that today, but this was very important to this part of our state. As we get further south, our next little town we're going to get to is the town of Palisade. And in the town of Palisade is my favorite bridge on the Mississippi. Now, we've glided under a number of bridges so far on our trip, but this is my favorite one. It was built over 100 years ago, and it's a railroad trestle bridge, and I love this bridge, just the style of it. It's just a beautiful bridge. As a photographer, I've photographed it many times over the years. So as I glided under the Palisade Bridge, I was looking up to see how it was built. It's just a really, really beautiful bridge. Before we get to the next town of Aiken, we're not going to get to Aiken, folks. I'm going to take you on a shortcut. Now you say, well, are there shortcuts on the river? There is in Minnesota. We have one. It's called a diversion channel. Historically, Aiken always suffered from spring flooding. In 1956, 1957, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers decided to help the town of Aiken and create a channel that would divert floodwaters away from the town every spring. And they created a 7-mile diversion channel. And I decided, because it's such a unique experience, I would paddle Minnesota's Erie Canal. Now, we don't call it our Erie Canal, but that's what I call it. And it really is a unique feature on the river. But I'll tell you, it was the most boring kayak stretch of the entire trip. It was straight as an arrow, no current, but I had to experience it. So we don't get to see the town of Aiken. Next time I'm on this part of the river, I will take that channel. That'll take us down to Aiken. But the flood diversion channel certainly has saved the town over the years, so that's been a really good thing. When we get out of the channel and we get on the other side of Aiken, we're in what we call the Cuyuna Iron Range. The Cuyuna is the third and smallest iron range we have in Minnesota. And it was discovered about 100 years ago, maybe 120 years ago now, by a man by the name of Kyler Adams. And he discovered it with his dog, Una. They had a farm, and that's where we get the name, the Cuyuna Iron Range. He was doing some survey work, and his compass was going haywire, and he realized that something was making his compass not work properly, so he reported it, and we then discovered this vein of iron ore, heavy in magnesium, and it was a very important, but a very small iron range in comparison to the other two that we have in Minnesota. And we will paddle right through the Cuyuna Iron Range. If you know towns such as Deerwood, Crosby, Ironton, these are the towns that were built because of the iron ore industry. And the Mississippi goes right through this section. And we're on our way to what will now be our largest town so far on the Mississippi. We're about to get to the town of Brainerd. Brainerd, like Bemidji, like Grand Rapids, was built because of logging. And that seems to be kind of the theme here, isn't it, of the upper Mississippi, logging. And when we get to, just before we get to Brainerd, we have to do another portage around another dam and mill, a paper mill. This paper mill was built and was put there because of the logging industry and the lumber industry, but they were famous for the development and the production of wallpaper. So you can thank these folks for that wallpaper you scrape off your walls before you have to paint. Maybe wallpaper will make a comeback, I don't know. But as we travel into Brainerd, we're on the Mississippi, And one of the things that when you think of Brainerd, you don't think of Brainerd as a river town. When I think of Brainerd, I think of it as a lake town. And that's what most Minnesotans think of Brainerd. But it really is a river town because the river flows right through the heart of Brainerd, but you don't see it. One of the reasons you don't see Brainerd for most people that come to town is because it's in a deep gorge. There's high banks on both sides. You don't get the views you do in some other towns, such as Little Falls, or even St. Cloud, or even the Twin Cities. So Brainerd, the river is kind of hidden in Brainerd. So we'll glide right by Brainerd as we head further south. And you remember, we're going all the way to Little Falls, so we just have another couple of features before we finish our 400 miles. When we get south of Brainerd, again, the river's getting bigger as we move further south. Other rivers are coming in, feeding the Mississippi. And as we get further south, I was surprised when I heard a lot of laughter and giggling from the riverbank. And I came around the bend, and before me, on the riverbank, was a bunch of nuns or sisters from the convent in Little Falls on a day outing to the river. And they were having a water fight and mud fight on the river. Now, they didn't know I was there because they couldn't hear me coming in the kayak. And it was really funny because as I got closer, they looked up and saw me. And I paddled over and introduced myself, and they said, "How long were you there?" And I said, "For a while." They said, "Were you watching us?" And I said, "Yes." And they were embarrassed, of course. They asked if I would go paddle up the river and come down again and take a picture of them acting the way they should. And I thought, sure, I'll do that for you. But you know what? The river should be enjoyed by everyone, including the sisters having a mud fight and water fight on the river. That's perfect, right? So this picture you see here in the program is really the second photo I took, and I promised I would not show anyone the first one, so you'll have to bribe me if you want to see that photo. So then I left the sisters, said goodbye, and just around the next bend, we come to another historic site on the Mississippi. Not related to logging, but related to early settlement. It is the town site of Crow Wing. Today we have a state park there. It's called Crow Wing State Park. The town of Crow Wing was one of the largest towns north of the Twin Cities. In fact, in 1870, it was larger than St. Cloud. And when we get to the town of Crow Wing, you'll say, where's the town? It's gone, with the exception of one building. One house is left in the town of Crow Wing. It's the oldest house north of the Twin Cities. It's the Clement Bellaloo house. He was the mayor of Crow Wing. And there's a really interesting story. We won't have time to tell it today about what happened to the town of Crow Wing and why it disappeared, and why Clement Bellaloo's house is the only one standing. So maybe I'll tell that story in a future show. But Crow Wing State Park and the historic town of Crow Wing is near the site of the historic fort that we call Fort Ripley. And we call it Fort Ripley until the 1870s. And then by the turn of the century, it changed to Camp Ripley, and that's what we know the site today. But Fort Ripley was the original name. It was a fort that was built back in the frontier days of Minnesota on the banks of the Mississippi River. And here's a plaque dedicated to the site of Fort Ripley. Now, people ask me all the time, who's Ripley? How'd we get that name? Where'd that come from? And it's an interesting story. Mr. Ripley, he was actually a general in the War of 1812. He's got a great name. His name is Eleazar Wheelock Ripley. And I just love saying that name. But Eleazar Wheelock Ripley died in a battle in Canada against the British in the War of 1812. Now we have a fort and now a camp named after him. And Camp Ripley has expanded over the years. Now it's a National Guard training center for a lot of National Guards, especially here in Minnesota. But other servicemen and women from all over the country train at Camp Ripley today. We're about to get to our last town on our trip, which is Little Falls. Now, Little Falls actually has a falls, and like Brainerd, like Bemidji, like Grand Rapids, all of these towns were built there because of the lumber industry, and there was a large mill at the falls that the town is named after, Little Falls. But it isn't really little. as I looked at it, I thought it's the biggest falls I've seen so far on the trip. But I did have to portage around it. But when we think of Little Falls, we think of kind of the most famous person probably in American history from Minnesota. And that, of course, is Charles Lindbergh. He was not born in Little Falls, but he spent his boyhood years on the banks of the Mississippi. And here's his house. As we know, Charles Lindbergh in 1927, he flew the Spirit of St. Louis across the Atlantic, the first flight across the ocean. And we can claim him as a Minnesota guy and a Little Falls and Mississippi guy too. So that's kind of cool. So now we'll stop here in Little Falls. I've completed the journey. I got a lot of great pictures for the guidebook for the group that hired me to do this. And we got to stop and rest. How many are tired? It's been a long trip. You've paddled 400 miles. You never thought you could do that in 45 minutes, but you did. And nobody got hurt. We had some mosquitoes. We had some poison ivy, but we did get to see a lot of wildlife. And we experienced a lot of Minnesota history. And that's what's really cool about these trips on the river. You see Minnesota from a different perspective. So take a rest here. And if you like this show, I'll continue it. We'll head down to the Twin Cities. Eventually, we'll paddle all the way through Minnesota on the Mississippi. Remember, Minnesota has over 700 miles of the Mississippi River. We've covered 400 of it, so we've gone over halfway. But there's so much more adventures to come. So I just want to say thank you for coming along. I hope it's been fun. I hope your back and your neck will recover from the exercise, but you're mentally healthier for it. And I certainly have enjoyed bringing this trip to you. It's a trip that I'll never forget doing. It changed my life, and I hope it's been fun for you. But again, thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again on a future show.
Well, what an adventure we've just been on. We have traveled 400 miles by kayak. How many are tired? My back is a little sore, but what a great adventure that we have seen. Maybe we haven't seen Minnesota that way in the past, but to travel it by river, you will get a glimpse of Minnesota in a new, unique way. And I think you did today. What were some of the highlights for you? I know for me, I love that first 90 miles that we leave Lake Itasca and we go up to Lake Bemidji. And then going through the big lakes in northern Minnesota, that was kind of fun. And then through the beautiful farmland of central Minnesota as we get into Little Falls. That was great. That was a great part of the river as well. So the river is so diverse, but I love the stories. I love the history. And the Mississippi Headwaters, the group out of Brainerd that had me do the guidebook, I learned that they watch over the river because the river is such an important, vital resource to our state. And do you know, folks, that the river is cleaner today than it was 50 years ago? We're doing a good job. Do we have work to do? Absolutely. But we're doing a good job to preserve the river for future generations to enjoy it. So I'm glad you joined me. Thank you to St. Louis Park Community Education and to Park TV Channel 15 for bringing the show to you. Thank you.